Welcome back to another tutorial. Today we are going to add the melee function so we can beat things with our weapons. Now, just a disclaimer, this is just the scripting. The animations that we have so far for these arms don't include a melee animation. Normally you would have a unique melee animation for every single weapon. Think Halo, for example, where every weapon has a different movement. You've got a little flip when you hit them with a pistol, all those things. So that requires as many animations as there are weapons. In this case, there would be 5 weapons, so there's 5 animations. So I'm gonna leave that to you guys. Hopefully you've thought about maybe getting in contact with an animator at some point, but all the code will be set up, and if you hypothetically bought animations or teamed up with an animator, you could just plug those animations straight in. Anyway, enough gas bagging. Let's get to it. So we're going to start in weapon base, because just like our fire weapon and our reload weapon, we're going to turn this into a function. Let's pop over to the event graph, come over to functions over here, hit the plus sign, and we're going to say melee. Now our melee is going to depend on the enemy being within a certain radius. That range is going to be determined by a sphere. So let's get a sphere collision. So I'm going to detach this from the skeleton mesh just for now, because I want to explain to you how this ideally is going to work. Again, something that we're limited to not having the animations. And you don't have to follow me here. You can just watch along if you want. Go over to imports, military weapon dark, open the weapons, and we have a look at the skeletal mesh. We always start with the assault rifle, so let's start with that. Now, remember how we used the muzzle flash in the episode that we did the rocket launcher for, and we used that as a place to spawn the rocket. There's also another socket here for where the reload animation is going to be taking place. Basically, what we would do here if we had an animation is, if the animation was using the butt of the weapon, we'd put another socket here, and that socket would then be where this sphere is attached to. Because we don't have those animations, we can't do that. What we're going to do just for now is have the sphere attached to the skeletal mesh, and we're going to just move it in front of the weapon. I'm just going to move it, let's say 75 for now, and we're going to call this sphere melee range. So maybe you want to make this range a little bit bigger for some weapons and a little bit smaller. You can do that individually. We might even do that in this episode. But then once that's attached, we would attach it to the socket, same way we did the spawning of the muzzle flash. So back over to the melee function up here. Now we're going to get this melee range. We're going to get overlapping actors. And then we're going to hold F, click anywhere in the graph for a for each loop, because you can see here that it's basically going to get every actor that's overlapping this, and it's going to punch them into an array. Now, every single enemy that's in that range, we want to affect health. And then this here would be our melee damage. So maybe you want some weapons that have higher damage than others, and you could make that a variable here. Just for a placeholder, I'm going to hit, I don't know, let's say 25. And then we're going to also play sound. And we can use play sound attached to the component, and that component will be the melee range. Again, our lovely weapon pack has a knife sound. We used one of them before, but now we're going to use the knife swing. So 2 ways to do this. We could plug this into completed, so it happens after the loop, or we could have it happen beforehand. I'm going to move it beforehand because it seems a little bit cleaner that way. So many different ways to do the same task that it doesn't really matter. Now, just so we get an idea of what's going on here, let's come back over to the viewport, click on melee range, and if we scroll down here, we can actually untick this box here under rendering, hidden in game, which means that when we're in the game, we're going to be able to see where this is. So let's hit play. And you can see that I actually can't see where that is now, because if we have a look at all these other weapons, it's appeared to the side. So we need to adjust that to our other axis. We wouldn't have known that if it wasn't for making that visible. And I remembered why that's happened. It's because if we actually look at the skeletal mesh, it's actually rotated by 90 degrees. So we need to move this melee range along either plus or negative y axis. Let's try plus 75, see where that puts it. and we should be able to see it in the world. Yep, there we go. So now when I hit play, you can see that in front. You can see it's rather large. You can see it's a little bit low as well. Let's bring that up a little bit on the Z-axis. I kind of want to be able to see the melee range entirely, and I'm going to knock it down to about 16, just a little bit higher. Okay, that's not too bad. So with that set up, now let's go over and in our blueprints, let's open up our core and our B_hero, because we need to tell our player controller to tell our character to tell our weapon to hit the enemy, which is what we've been doing up here with our interfaces. This is essentially the player controller, which is passing through directly to our pawn, our character, our B_hero, and using this interface to communicate. So let's start with the input. Let's go back over to our test map. On settings, click project settings, come down to input, because we haven't actually binded an input yet. So let's hit the plus sign above action mappings, a little bit of a throwback. Let's type in melee. And here we can decide which buttons we want to use. I'm going to pick V. And I'm also going to click the plus sign next to the actual binding so we can get something from the gamepad. My preference is gamepad, right shoulder. But you can make that anything you want it to be. So now we have our melee button. Back over to B_hero. Let's right click and get melee. I'm going to keep this grouped together with these guys because it is something attached to our weapon. Remembering that the goal is to always leave everything as readable as possible. Copy equipped weapon and child actor from one of these other inputs over here because it's going to be following the same script. And next up, we're going to need another interface call. So let's come back over to test, come down to interfaces. Let's open up I_weapons. Let's create a new function up here and call it melee. You can see here because we've already used that inside inputs, we can't use it again inside of an interface. So we could call it something like melee attack. I'm sure I will come up with a better name for that later on, but for now we'll stick with melee attack. Attach that interface up there in case we need to tinker with it again. But now if I drag out of the child actor and go melee attack, we get a message via interface. So that's how that's going to work. Compile and save that. Seems I've accidentally closed base weapon. So let's come over to weapons again, open up weapon base. And now inside the event graph for weapon base over here, because it's going to be essentially the same code for every single weapon, the same way that iron sights on and off and reload weapon will be the same code, save the animations and the animation time. We're going to put this here. Type in melee attack and get the event melee attack, making sure it's got this little interface icon here. And then we can right click and type in melee and get the function inside the weapon, which because that's only a part of the weapon, it's totally okay for us to have the same name there. Just like our reload weapon here, we can also add a cooldown time, and we will do that. But for now, let's just make sure that we are successfully meleeing. Into the test map, let's hit play. Let's press V nowhere near the enemy. And we are getting that sound effect. So that means it should be working. Let's aim at our enemy and press X. Now, this enemy isn't moving at the moment because I've been playing with some physics. And so because I've enabled physics, he's kind of stuck to the floor and he ain't going anywhere. So now I'm going to walk up to him. I'm going to press V. And there we go. We can see our melee is working. And if I hit him 4 times because he has 100 health, that's going to kill him. Onto our melee enhancements. Back over to weapon base. Next up, let's do a similar thing here where we are going to have a delay that tells us when we're out of that melee cooldown. So we want our melee cooldown to finish before we can shoot again. It's going to be a very quick cooldown, but it's just so our animations don't clash, because if we're melee and start shooting, especially if our melee animation is moving the weapon away from firing forward, it's not going to make a lot of sense. So let's create a variable called isMeleeing. Inside of our melee, we're going to first check to see if we are meleeing. Because I want to run off the true branch, we're going to is not meleeing. So if we're not already going through the melee animation, then we can continue on to actually using the melee animation, making some more room. Let's plug this in over here. So if we're not meleeing, we can then set meleeing to true. If we pop back over to fire weapon, we can take a look at how we've played our animation here. So we can copy this over skeletal mesh and play animation over to melee. So this is how we would be playing our animation the same way, and we'd be inputting that separate animation per weapon. Now, of course, we don't have an animation, as I've already said several times, but let's create that variable in hopes that you will be able to get that animation at some point. Let's right click on anim reload and duplicate. We will call this anim melee. Drag that up there so they're all grouped together. And we'll drag anim melee up here. Next up, let's get our return node. And with our return node selected, let's click on the outputs over here. Change this output to a float and call it cooldown. And our cooldown is going to be determined based on our anim melee length and just like we did over here with our reload, where we punched in that variable, we want sequence length here. And we'll plug in our sequence length here. So let's compile and save that out into the event graph. Now we can go and get that delay. Again, we can't use delays in functions. And then once we're out of here, once that delay is fired, we can go is meleeing false. So that's going to prevent us from spamming our melee. If we want to come back over to fire weapon, another thing we'll need to check for before we fire our weapon is meleeing. And we need to make sure we are not meleeing before we fire our weapon. And also grabbing this return node and plugging that into false. You know what? I might just do a bit of cleanup here so this is easier to read. There we are, that's a little bit better. So fire weapon is going to check if we're meleeing, so we can't fire unless we're not meleeing. Reload will do the same thing as well. If we come over to reload, we need to make sure that we're not meleeing. And because it's the same blueprint, we can actually copy over that branch and those two nodes. So there it is. If we're reloading, we need to check that we're not meleeing, and we need to also copy over that return node there so that we can tell the script outside the function whether we've successfully reloaded or not. So your melee function is pretty much ready to go, and I hope I've explained everything well enough. One last thing I will do, if you wanted to adjust that melee range for each individual blueprint, all you'd need to do is select the melee range within that weapon and make the adjustments here. For instance, the pistol is a little bit too far away. So let's go back over to our pistol and we can click on melee range. In the viewport, we can bring that back. Let's say about 50. Still a little bit further away, but a shorter range for that. And let's say we wanted to make the range larger on the rocket launcher, we could go and do that. Let's say we wanted to make it 100. And we could also make that range bigger as well. We could make that 32. So you can adjust that melee range per blueprint. Just remember that if you make any changes back in weapon base, that will undo them and you will have to go and reprogram them because weapon base changes will override the changes in every other blueprint. We're going to leave it there for now. Hopefully that's been helpful to you guys. Hope to see you guys in the next episode.